Good afternoon, everyone. Really? Nobody's going to even respond? I get nothing? Welcome to the Workspace Environment Management session. My name is Jim Yannick. I'm an end-user computing architect. I work for the end-user computing business unit based out of Palo Alto. I'm actually based out of Minneapolis in the United States. I'm going to make two apologies in advance in this session. First apology is I have a cold, so I may cough a little bit, and I apologize for that. I'm trying to keep my throat as lubricated as I can, and I'll also apologize for my American accent in advance. So this is the disclaimer slide. Anything that I say that talks about futures may or may not actually come to be, so keep that in mind. You've probably never seen this slide in one of our sessions before. And then this morning, how many of you went to the keynote this morning? Just curious. And also just curious, how many were in my earlier session this morning on app volumes? Okay, you're going to see some material that you've seen before, but that's okay. You'll really remember it now. This is basically Workspace Environment Management is part of what we're talking about here with Workspace Suite, where we're talking about desktops, AirWatch for mobile, and content management, all given through Identity Manager, so I can have that single login. Obviously, we've gotten a few kudos. AirWatch, obviously, top of the heap on Gartner, and of course, we're very happy to have achieved the leader position on desktop. I've been at VMware almost 8 years now, and have been working in the what was VDM, and then became View, and is now Horizon in this space for a long time. So it's really nice to see us moving to the top here. So for those of you who are our customers in this space, thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about Workspace Environment Management. What is that? So what we're really about here is focusing on the user as the center of the workspace universe, so to speak. So we're talking about app delivery and isolation, things like app volumes and ThinApp, and we'll talk a lot about app volumes and a bit about ThinApp today. We're talking about user persona and dynamic IT policy. So User Environment Management, or Manager, which is one of our products, allows me to set a lot of real good policies and do it dynamically based on things in the environment like an IP address range or an OS version. I'm going to do some demo here today, and you'll see some of this in action. Just curious, how many of you have played with User Environment Manager? And how many of you, just curious, were customers of Immediate when it was still Immediate? A couple of you, great, great. And then also end-to-end monitoring, being able to look at that whole stack, the vSphere stack, the Horizon stack, now published apps on the Citrix side, and being able to do all of this regardless of whether we're virtual, we're cloud, or we're physical. So being able to, again, focus on that user and what they need, and being able to go from any device to be able to do that. So first, we'll talk a little bit about app packaging and isolation. So ThinApp, we've had ThinApp for a long time. This technology has been around for pretty close to 20 years. How many of you have used ThinApp? Okay, a bunch of you. The main focus of ThinApp is really that ability to isolate, that ability to separate the application from the OS, to make the application kind of portable because we package it in a single executable and we can distribute it in a variety of different ways. But really the ability to make sure that we can create a package that can run without conflict. So if I need to, for example, deploy Windows Explorer IE8 with a legacy version of Java, I can do that with ThinApp and have it run side by side with other versions of IE. A lot of people have asked, well, what's the future of ThinApp? ThinApp's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Every few months, somebody says, oh, ThinApp is dead, VMware's abandoning it, and it's just not happening. In fact, there's a lot of synergy between app volumes and ThinApp because I can put a ThinApp in an app volumes app stack and deliver it to a user. The next piece we talk about is how are we provisioning applications? Windows apps, published apps, SaaS apps. Really now with Horizon, we can, we can provision applications in a lot of different ways, either through a full VDI desktop, an RDSH shared desktop, RDS applications, so individual applications, and ThinApps as well. We can still provision ThinApps directly to those Windows desktops. We can use ThinApps on RDS servers. We can use them within app stacks. And being able to do all of that from a single secure platform. RDS, we started that last year when we released Horizon 6. We've made a lot of improvements to it. So with a lot of our client and agent releases, we've continued to add features to this. So things like scanner redirection, client drive redirection, HTML access, all now available with RDS published applications as well as full desktops. All right, the next piece we're going to talk about is real-time application delivery and lifecycle management. So this is really about app stack. So different way of looking at things. So traditionally, whether it's a physical desktop or a virtual desktop, we kind of install everything in one bucket. So all the applications get installed and sort of get interweaved with the operating system. What we want to do is go to more of a just-in-time model, being able to deliver a very generic OS. So we're really starting to focus more on that non-persistent floating desktop, put the app volumes agent out there, and then be able to provision multiple app stacks. So an app stack is basically a VMDK. It's a construct that is a VMDK with a bunch of applications installed in it. And I might have multiple app stacks for different users. So I might have a core apps that everybody gets, so Office and Acrobat Reader and those kinds of things, and then departmental-based or job role function-based app stacks. There's also the concept of a writable volume. The writable volume allows me to give a user a volume that's a read-write entity so that they can install user-installed applications, data, and persona information. So combining all of that, I can take and plug those things along with user environment management into a generic non-persistent floating desktop and give a persistent user experience. And we'll see some of that later. So let's talk about delivery here. So if I look at this, so there's my non-persistent desktop there, and I'm going to log into it as user one. So user one's going to log in, and when they log in, they're going to get a set of apps. I think user one just logged out. Okay, there we go. We're going to get a set of apps. So that user is going to get their background with their little doggy and their little kitty cat, and they're going to get SAP and Word and Acrobat. Then they're going to log out. That same desktop, somebody else is going to log in, and that's going to be user two. So user two logs in, and user two is going to have a different set of apps and a different desktop background. So they've got more of a scenic background there and a different set of applications. But it allows me to take that generic desktop and make the user experience persistent, make the user experience unique. And then that user is going to log out, and we're going to go off to the next user. When we talk about UEM, we'll get into this a little bit, but I can also clean up all the persona stuff when that user's done. So when they log out and their applications are unloaded, I can take all the persona stuff that I injected into that machine and keep it clean so I don't end up getting a profile bloat. So I can also deliver app volumes applications to RDSH servers or Citrix XenApp servers or generic terminal servers machines. I can assign app stacks. And we have a little bit of a different way of assigning them. So app stacks with app volumes can be assigned either on a user basis, so through an Active Directory group or an OU, or it can be assigned on a machine basis. When we assign them to a server like this, we're going to assign it on a machine basis, so then those applications all become available to be published out. With app volumes, we now support multi-vCenters. So somewhere around, I think, version 2.9, we started supporting multi-vCenters. There's a couple of considerations around multi-vCenter support. First of all, every vCenter's got to have the same credentials. We're going to fix that, but right now you need to have the same credentials. Host names have to be unique. Hopefully in your environment, your vCenter host names are unique. Data store names have to be unique too. And we basically will just set this up within the machine managers, which I'll show you here a little later. And we don't recommend that you revert from multi vCenter back to single vCenter. You went to multi vCenter for a reason, probably because of scale, so you need to stick with that. It's supported to revert back, but you may have unexpected results. We also added an App Volumes Broker Integration Service. This is something that specifically integrates with Horizon View. So I, as a user, log in, and I get to my connection server. When I get to that connection server, I get presented with my list of desktops, and I select that desktop. Once I do that, I'm going to report up to the AV manager and say, okay, this user's coming in. We know he's logging in. His login process is happening. Start mounting his app stack so that they're available for him. So it speeds up the login process a little bit, a couple extra seconds, and it's a nice bit of integration we have specifically with Horizon View. Just a few things about availability and resiliency. The App Volumes agent, we certainly recommend a load balancer so we can get a single namespace in front of the App Volumes manager. App Volume managers, although you can have one of them, we wouldn't recommend that in production. You'd want to have at least two so that you've got multiple App Volume managers, both for redundancy and for load. App Volumes managers can only support a certain number of users. They support about a single connection per second, so depending on how large your environment is, you want to have multiples of those. And on the back end, we use a SQL database. Really need to have that database clustered so you have high availability for the database. Because when we connect, when we log in, the agent's going to check in with the App Volume Manager for what you're entitled to, so what app stacks you're provisioned for. And it needs to look at that database. If it can't look at the database, you're going to get a message that says virtualization is not available and your user's not going to get their app stacks. If the users are already attached and the database goes down, they'll keep running. We really use the database when we're connecting and disconnecting. Some rules to scale, I kind of talked about a little bit of this. Load balancers, make sure you've got at least two App Volumes managers. I talked about the one connection per second. Generally speaking, even if you're in an environment where you've got a call center and 500 users are going to log in at the same time, they're not all going to hit enter at once. It's going to be a little staggered, so it's not a problem. But you want to understand what your use case is about and make sure you've got more than enough App Volumes managers to handle the traffic. Again, clustered SQL, app stacks best practices. Each app stack is a many-to-one construct, so I can have multiple users attaching to a single app stack. We say about 750 to 1,000 per app stacks. You'll see here in a bit when we talk about storage how I can have the same app stack replicated across data stores, so then I can scale. So let's say I need to get 5,000 users. I want to scale that across probably 5 data stores to make sure we've got enough IOPS and that the attachments aren't a problem. Up to about 15 app stacks per virtual machine. I got a little star there because it's not a hard and fast rule. You can actually go a bit beyond that, especially in smaller environments. The larger your environment gets, the more contention there is. So we want to be under that 15. And then the 10,000 agents per App Volumes Manager cluster really has to do more with our standard view block and pod architecture. A block is a group of about 2,000 desktops or 2,000 sessions, and a pod is about 10,000 users, so basically 5 blocks put together from the management standpoint, and that's where we really want to scale. That's our current scaling. Some of this is going to change. Both the scaling and the performance will change for 2.10, which will ship later this year, and then into next year when we ship 3.0. We have a lot of focus on scale, so you'll see these numbers increase pretty significant. So I said I'd talk a bit about storage. Again, the app stacks themselves are read-only, one-to-many. The default template for creating an app stack is 20 gigs. So there's a little VMDK, it's not that little, it's a 20 gig VMDK, that I attach to a provisioning machine. So I attach it to the provisioning machine, I install all the applications that are going to go into it, I detach it, I seal it up, and then I can provision it out to users. Most of the time, I don't need 20 gigs to install applications. You'll see us, when I do the demo, a set of applications, they really take up about 200, 230 megs. So we created a template that's just a gig large. So because Although the first time we write out this template or the app stack, we'll thin provision it. If we copy it to multiple data stores, it'll get blown up. So we don't want to take up that whole 20 gigs, and we're really only using 250 megs. So you can create smaller templates. It's just that the out-of-the-box template is 20 gig. Writable volumes, which I talked about earlier, that are the place that I can do user-installed applications and where I can take profile and data, are one-to-one. So each user is going to get their own writable volume. It's a read-write volume. So keep in mind that you're going to be doing writes. Some users aren't going to do a lot of writes. Some users are going to be very heavy on writes, like developers, for example, might be reinstalling and uninstalling and installing new programs all the time, so have a heavier write profile. You can use tiered storage here. For your lighter users that aren't going to write much, you can probably put them on tier 3 storage. You may need to move up to a middle tier storage for users that are going to be heavier in terms of IOPS. And then there's a concept of a storage group. So I talked about replicating. If you look there over on the right side, that yellow volume is an app stack. And what happens when I put it in a storage group, if I set it up this way, is it will replicate to the other data stores in the storage group automatically. So this is the way I can scale it out. Remember, I only want about 1,000 attachments to each VMDK there, so if I need 3,000 users, I can automatically scale that across 3 data stores. Writable volumes act a little differently. We don't replicate those across the data stores, but you can select about how they get placed, whether they're spread evenly across the data stores or if they're just distributed sequentially. I go data store 1, data store 2, data store 3. So there's a couple rules you can set up there. And again, you can place these on specific data stores that kind of match that I/O profile you're looking for. Obviously, the big thing here is we want to eliminate the attach limitation, and we want to be able to aggregate those I/Os across a bunch of different data stores. So what happens when the app volumes agent logs in? It's important to understand the mechanics of what's going on here. Well, first, that agent is going to connect to the App Volumes Manager, so it's going to check in. And at that point, the App Volume Manager is going to say if there's any pending operations that didn't get cleaned up from before. Do I owe you any attachments? Are there any detachments in place? If there is a machine-based attachment, that'll get done. And if there's a machine-based attachment, any user assignments will get ignored. It's an either-or. I can either attach to the machine or I can attach to the user. Most situations are going to be user-based attachments because you're going to want to match that to your users. The RDSH servers, Citrix servers, potentially kiosk machines might get a machine-based attachment. We're going to check into the database for any particular assignments. So when I'm logging in, I want to know what assignments are there for that user. And then once I've checked that, that's going to get attached to the machine. Writable volume gets attached first, and then app stacks get attached. And I'll show you a little bit about how you can juggle around the precedence of attachment and what order things attach. And I kind of talked about what the difference is for RDSH or XenApp. It's really going to be a machine-based assignment. There aren't going to be any writable volumes, but it gives you a way to provision those machines to get a set of applications by using AppStack, and I'll talk here in a minute about the lifecycle advantages of that. So let's talk a little bit about single sign-on access. So VMware Identity Manager is a place we can go to get a whole bunch of different types of applications. So everything from a virtual desktop to an RDS application to ThinApps, SaaS-based applications, web apps, all available through a single user workspace. So Sanjay talked about this morning about the digital workspace. This is a really big part of that because now I can get also mobile apps as well. Office 365 is a big use case for it, but it gives me a single place to go. We at VMware all use this every day. We log in, we connect, and we authenticate here. We happen to use RSA Secure ID if we're off the network. And then once we're on there, we have access to a whole host of different applications. This is also part of Workspace Environment Management. So I said I'd talk a little bit about application maintenance. So the concept here is I've got thin apps and native apps that I've installed into app stacks. So I've created a set of app stacks that now are available to me in my environment. I can then provision those app stacks into a number of different places. So whether it's virtual and it's going into Horizon or XenApp or Xen Desktop or RDSH. And what happens is, let's say I'm talking about Office. I've got an app stack that has Office. Office has fairly frequent updates, and I need to be able to apply those updates and give some kind of life. So what I can do is I can maintain those app stacks. So now I've got an Office app stack that's being attached to users. I can take a copy of that app stack. I can attach it to my provisioning machine. I can apply those patches or updates. I can test it out, make sure everything works. And then on the next cycle, I can attach those out to my user. I can take away the old app stack, give them the new app stack. The next time they log in, they have the new version. So I have an ability to have some application lifecycle management here within the environment. Final thing I'll talk about here before we get into some more detail here is just application monitoring and monitoring of the virtual environment in general. So we have a vRealize operations for Horizon, vRealize operations for published apps. So now I can look at kind of end-to-end metrics. It allows me to look at the vSphere environment, so things like storage latency and vCPU contention. So I can get a lot of vSphere information. Plus I can look at things like HDX latency or PC over IP latency to see if that's affecting the user experience. It gives me one place to go to get a lot of metrics that keeps also a lot of history of what's going on. So I have the ability to put this in place in my environment and monitor over time what's happening, so I know what normal starts to look like. So when I start to move out of normal, I can see that. It also helps me with predicting scale. So if I need to do capacity planning, it's also a tool that does that. Okay, let me talk about User Environment Manager. So User Environment Manager, this is the Amidio acquisition we did earlier this year. Gives me the ability to do a lot of advanced policy management. So I can manage user profile, I can manage user personalization so that users can personalize their application. I can push out application profiles. I'll show you a little later with VLC as an example, how we can use one executable and push out 3 different languages just simply by setting policy. It gives me the ability to make everything contextual. So if I'm on a certain operating system or I'm coming from a certain IP address, a lot of different things that I can change what's going on within the environment. So that, again, whether it's a virtual, physical, or cloud environment, I can give that user who's using her iPad right now the same experience as when she logs in on her MacBook into those virtual environments. One of the things I really like about User Environment Management is it really scales up very well. There's no infrastructure involved. There's no database server. I'll show you the architecture here in a couple minutes. There's no database server. There's no back-end kind of things. There's a couple of file shares and there's an agent. So it's very easy to scale up for large environments for thousands and thousands of users. We have large customers here in Europe, who've been around since the Amidio days, who are literally doing tens of thousands of users, and it's actually very, very simple to use. I'll show you a bit of it later. So the concept here, kind of taking our model that I talked about earlier, is taking that settings piece and instead of managing it as kind of a monolithic profile, having the ability to do a lot of interesting things. User environment settings, like printer mappings and drive mappings, configuring applications, like I talked about, different skins, different languages for an application, allowing the user to personalize things, and being able to do this dynamically, so that if there are changes in the environment, a good example here is, let's say I'm a nurse working in a hospital, and I log in and connect to my workstation, and I map a printer, and I move to a different floor later in the shift. When I reconnect, that printer can be reevaluated and I can be mapped to a printer that's on my floor instead of the floor I was on 2 hours ago. So, very dynamic. This is architecture here. I can kind of talk you through some of this. In the center, there's 2 file shares. essential configuration share, which is where all the generic stuff that the console and all the users are going to use, and then a user share. The user share is where their customizations can be put into place. I use a management console. The nice thing about the management console is there's no server, so I can run it from any Win 7 machine or Win 8 machine and just be able to get access to it. As we move forward, what we're looking at is a unified console to manage some of this together. So managing app volumes together, managing User Environment Manager. That'll be more of a web-based console, so you wouldn't even need to run the Windows console anymore. It'd be web-based, but that's a future. We've also got a couple self-support tools. There's a self-support tool, and I'll show you a bit of that in the demo, where I as a user can go reset my settings. There's a help desk support tool where the help desk can reset settings and also take a look at the logs that are available. A couple of infrastructure requirements. I won't go into this too much. There are some GPOs that need to be set to make this work. I already kind of talked about the shares. I can also use folder redirection. Obviously, I recommend you redirect folders if you don't want to be managing like my documents and that sort of thing. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but these are just the, you guys will get the slides. These are the permissions, and they're documented of what we need to be able to set up for both the central config share for the administrator and the user shares for the users. This is just a quick walkthrough of setting things up, kind of a step-by-step. It's all documented. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. It's here for reference. I want to be able to get to the demo and leave enough time for questions as well. So this is interesting. So we manage applications. So traditionally, Windows settings and application settings kind of get managed as big blocks, right? When we get into User Environment Manager, we break that up. So we start managing all those applications individually. And those little beans there represent sort of the settings for both Windows settings and application settings. The last application we're managing here happens to be Acrobat Reader, and maybe something happens to it. The user goes in and does something. It's always the user's fault, by the way. It's never IT. The user goes in and does something, and all of a sudden the application doesn't work or doesn't work the way they want it to work. I can go and take that set of configuration and swap it out either for a last known good, the last time the user archived it, the last time they logged out probably, or all the way back to the way I distribute it to them. So I can fix that single application instead of having to wipe the whole profile or to try to spend a ton of time troubleshooting what they changed. Another unique thing here is just-in-time configuration and application personalization. We have a thing called Direct Flex. The agent is called the Flex engine. Direct Flex allows me to set it up so that when I launch an application, I apply settings. When I exit an application, I remove the settings. So what happens is I log in, and when I log in, we want to keep the base profile as small as possible, maybe a small mandatory profile so that the login is really quick, right? Then when I go and do a logon, I can import things like keyboard, mouse, all the Windows settings that I maybe want to set up using UEM. And then when a user comes in and launches an application, so I'm going to launch Adobe, I can inject whatever settings I want for that application. Environment settings, application personalization configuration. And then all the time that the user is using that, those settings are available. When they exit the application, I can remove all those settings. So let's say I need to map a drive or map a printer for that application. When they're done using that application, I can remove those things from the profile. And then when they log out, anything they changed will get written to their profile. And you'll see some of that here in a bit. All right, so again, our focus here with Workspace Environment Management is on that end user and bringing a good experience here. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to switch over to some demo. Ideally, plan A was I was going to do this demo live, but I have some issues with access to my lab. But fortunately, I predicted this. So I have a video that I'm going to run through and talk through that'll show you all the same things that I was planning on showing. So let me just switch over to that. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is show you a little bit in App Volume. So what we're going to do is log in. We're logged into the App Volumes console, and we're going to take a look at a few things there. So first, I'm going to go into the Volumes setup. And what I can look at inside of Volumes, I'll let that go a little further, is I can see all of the app stacks that I have available. So I'm looking right now at app stacks specifically. And in this test environment, let me just mention the test environment here for a second. By the way, these 3 chairs are vacant. If anybody wants to come up and sit in one of them, you're welcome to do that. This environment has an ESX host. It's all virtualized. An ESX host, a Windows XP machine, a Windows 7 machine, and a Windows 8.1 machine. And it has an App Volumes Manager, which is what we're going against with this console, is we're logged into the App Volumes Manager so that we can configure things. So I have 2 app stacks set up here. One of them is at the bottom, it's kind of a core app. So there's in this case here, core apps are pretty simple. It's FileZilla, Notepad++, and a couple of other apps. And then we have an app stack that is actually a ThinApp. It's a ThinApp of IE8 with a legacy version of Java, I think 1.4.2. So there's 2 app stacks available in the environment, and we pre-configured these through the process I kind of talked about of provisioning them. So then we'll go and take a look at what we have in terms of writable volumes. So writable volumes are, those are those read-write volumes. In this environment, obviously I only have one. It's a very small environment. I can either pre-populate these and assign them to users, or I can just set them up so that they get automatically assigned, again, based on AD group or an OU. And then these are one-to-one. Each user would have their own writable volume. If we look in the directory and we go under users, I can look at the one user I have here, which is Chris, and I can see a bit of information about what app stacks they have attached at the moment, which are none right now because I haven't assigned any, and what app stacks are provisioned. One of the things we get asked a lot is how do we set precedence? So when we attach app stacks, what goes first? Well, the writable volume always goes first, and then it's sort of random based on how you provision those app stacks, but I can go in and I can change that order, and I'll show you that after we set this up. But this is where you go in and do that within this users page. So next, we'll just take a quick look at something in the infrastructure. I'll let this go a little further. I talked about storage groups, and we'll just go in and edit the storage group. So there's a couple things here with storage groups. I only have one storage group here. I'm going to let this go just a second. Okay. This is one thing I didn't mention before. When I set up a storage group, one of the things I can do is I can decide how things get distributed. I can do it automatic, or I can do what we call a direct attach, and that works if I have ESX hosts that have local SSD. I can have the app stacks actually provisioned into that local SSD, which obviously adds some performance. It makes them very quick, and I can do that automatically here through the console when I set up storage groups. Okay, and then we'll just take a little quick look at this. So machine managers, what a machine manager is basically I'm setting up my machines that I'm going to use app stacks on, whether it is ESX host, which in this case it is, or it's vCenters. I talked about multiple vCenter support. This is where you go in and set that up. This is where you'd put in your list of vCenters, again with separate, different names, obviously different IP addresses. And then finally in the setup, this is just a storage dialog. This is where all of the app stacks, the writable volumes, the templates all get stored. This is how it installs by default. I can go in and change it in here. So now what we'll do is take a little look at provisioning app stacks. So what we want to do is, here's a machine. This is a Windows 7 machine, and I'm just going to go into add remove programs, and you can see there's not a lot installed here. There's just sort of the basic agents and stuff. And over here, where the icons are, there's just a couple of icons showing up. Most of them are related to UEM, which I'll show you a bit later. So there aren't any apps here. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to provision this machine for an app stack, and then we're going to see the app stacks actually get added to the machine. And pretty much this is the way it looks in real time. Now, I'm going to provision a user rather than a group. Normally you provision a group or an OU. We're just going to go ahead and provision it on a user. And we have a couple of choices. I can do it at next login or reboot, or I can do it immediately. In this case, we're going to do it immediately. Generally speaking, you're going to do it at a logon or reboot for production purposes, but for testing purposes, POC purposes, and certainly for demo purposes, it's really cool to do it immediately because you can see it happen in real time. So we're back to the machine, and in a couple seconds here, you'll see over here on this side of the screen, those icons populate. So those apps will be here. They're available now. I can launch FileZilla, for example, right away, and it's up and running. If I refresh over here in my Add Remove Programs now, you see the list of the applications are there in Add Remove Programs. Oops, I just skipped way ahead. Sorry. This is the downside to using a video. My apologies. Okay, where am I here? Let me show you something here on the back end. So when we add app stacks, they show up as VMDK. So now I'm in vCenter right now, and I'm looking at that Windows 7 machine. And you'll notice there are 3 hard disks. I happen to be highlighting hard disk 2 right now. And you'll see there's an app called IT Core Apps. That's that first app stack. And there's another app stack here, which we'll just highlight it here in a second. That is my IE8 and Java app, which is provisioned now to this machine as well. Notice that the size here is 1 gigabyte. I'm going to show you this here on disk here in a minute in the data stores. I talked about the template size, the default 20 gig, and then bringing it down to a smaller template size. That's what we did here. So first of all, if I go in and look in the data store, you'll see those app stacks sitting out there. So there's my IE app stack, my IT Core app stack, and they're both sitting here. Notice their size. They're about 200 plus megs actually on disk, and they're provisioned to 1 gig. That's because I used a smaller template. I didn't use the 20 gig template. So when I go in and take a look at the template storage here in a minute, which we also have stored on our shared storage, you'll see the 2 templates, and there's 2 there. There's the small template, which is the one we created that's 1 gig that we're using, and there's the standard default template, which is 20 gig. Again, the reason I want to use a smaller template is I just don't want to take up that much space on disk when I don't need to. One of the strengths of app volumes is it's saving you a lot of disk space, right? So if I have 1,000 people who are using that single, even if it's 20 gig app stack with all my Office in it, it's a lot better than installing Office 1,000 times in my virtual desktop. So it's a good disk space saving, so we want to continue to do that by managing those app stacks properly, by using the right-sized templates. So now I'm going to go in and show removing an app stack, and we're going to do that right away here. So this machine has This machine has an IE. I skipped ahead in a little bit in the video. So what I did previously is I provisioned this IE8 app stack, which has IE8 ThinApp along with Java to both these machines. What I've just done is deprovisioned it. So when I deprovision it, it'll disappear right away. So I'm going to continue. If you look at the icon over here in the corner, I'm going to continue the video, and you'll see that IE8 is just going to disappear. Now, this is one of those things that I can do, but it's not necessarily a good idea, especially if you got a user who's using the application. I don't want to instantly deprovision. What I want to do is say, okay, we're going to take that application away, but let's do it at the next login. Let's let them finish their work, because if I just yank it out from under, it's still running in memory, but it's gone. The app isn't there anymore, so within a little while of using it, it's just going to error out and possibly blue screen Windows, so we don't want to just yank it out from underneath them. Okay, so I'm going to show you some of User Environment Manager now. So the big thing with User Environment Manager, I talked about this a bit in the slides, is there isn't much to it in terms of infrastructure. There's no servers. There's really just a couple of a couple of shares, and we're just bringing up the 2 shares here so you can see those. There's the central config share, and there's the user share. Now, the central config share is where most of the really ini files is what we're using. You'll see that's here in a couple of minutes when I show you the directory structure. Ini files that control the application configurations and all of the configurations get stored. So that central share, and then each user has a share as well. So I create a share, and in this case there's only one user in this tree here because there's only one demo user, but all of my users would be listed here. All of their customizations are going to go into those shares. So I've got those shares, and then the other big piece is GPOs. So the way we configure is through GPO. And we ship an ADMX template that we manage, all set up in user settings. So it's not machine settings, it's user settings. And there's about a dozen GPOs that you can configure. There are really 3 that you have to configure to make it work, and I'm going to show that to you here just in a sec. The 3 GPOs are really around the shares, the locations of those shares, and also around turning it on as a group policy extension. So first, that central config share, I've got to tell it where those config files go. That's so that the Flex engine, which is the agent, knows where to get its information. And it's also so that when I bring the console up, I know where the information is coming from. That's the first share that has to be configured through group policy. And then the second one is what we call the profile archives. And that's where all of the end user configurations get put. And that's here. Now, what we do there is just give it, go all the way to the, there we go. Go to a directory that they're going to be able to have access to, and that their config goes. So it's going to be a directory on a % username, % kind of a path. The last piece really is the on-off switch, and that is run Flex Engine as a group policy extension. So we really have to turn this on so that the Windows settings can get applied early. We also run some things in the login script, and then the other thing I'll show you here real quick is we can set up a log off script that saves the user's settings at the end of their session. This is also the way we can kind of migrate things a little bit. So we get asked a lot about, well, how do I move from a different profile management solution or view persona? What I can do is I can stage these group policies, I can stage the shares, and I can turn on the log off script with a -s parameter, which saves user settings into their config, so that when they're changing things, I'm starting to capture that, and then turn things on later. The other thing I'll mention here is the fact that really this is a set of group policies and a couple of shares with a bunch of files in it really lends itself to business continuity and DR, because I can use DFS shares for my shares, so I can replicate that to a DR site, and I can have all these group policies staged in that DR site so that when I need to turn things on, I can point them at the proper shares and turn it on and have them have continuity for their user profile information. Okay, let's look at some things in the console. So again, the console can be run from any machine. There's no specific server I have to do it from. When I get into the console, what you're going to see is a little tree here that matches the directory tree. So I'm showing you 2 windows here. The top window is the console. The bottom window is the directory tree of that central config share. And you'll notice it has basically the same structure. So the console is reading its information from this directory tree. So like if I'm going to migrate to another environment, I can copy that whole directory tree, bring it over to another environment, point the console at it, and have all this information populated automatically. So I can go in and take a look at some of this, and there's a bunch of different applications here. Now, what I'm looking at right now is the applications that we're managing configuration for. And there's one little file in here that's a .flag file. That's what tells it it's a direct flex, so that the changes or whatever I set up for the user environment will happen when the user launches the application rather than at logon time. Because we don't want to load changes or configurations for 40 applications, and the user only ends up using 2 of them. We want to do those dynamically when they launch the application. And that's that .flag file we're pointing at right now. And then we can manage some things in Windows settings, you know, like mouse and keyboard and IE settings, for example, can be managed from here. And we can also manage quite a bit in the user environment, things like printer mappings, drive mappings, et cetera. So I talked about some of those in the presentation, and this is where you set these things up. So like, for example, this is a printer mapping that we're managing based on, if I go to the conditions tab, based on an IP address range. So if I'm on a certain IP address range, this printer is going to get mapped for me. So that's an example of a Windows environment thing that we can set up. I can also manage shortcuts from here. So there's a couple shortcuts, and really this is calc, and it's being managed. The only condition for this shortcut being on the desktop is, does the calc file exist? And you'll see when we go to the desktop that calc and notepad both have shortcuts on the desktop. So I can set those up really quickly in here. And then I can also do triggered tasks. So when a condition happens, trigger a task. So a really good example of this is printer mapping. So the task that's going to trigger that is a connection. So if I reconnect to my desktop, I want to trigger a task to change the printer mapping, to check the printer mapping. So I can make that happen on certain conditions. So let's look at some application configuration. So first thing I want to look at, and just show you here, is we can, go back a little bit. We can capture an application configuration. The big challenge of knowing what to configure is what is it that the application needs to have configured. So we have a thing called the application profiler that we can run. We can open and close the application and capture a bunch of information. It's a little hard to see, but this information about VLC was captured from the application profiler, and it shows me that all the data is under app data VLC. It would also capture any registry data so that I would know any locations where registry information was being written. I can also add things manually. So if I happen to know this application needs another directory, I can go in and add that directory. In this case, it doesn't, so we'll just take that back out. This is where I can go and get information about, this is where I can go and clean things up. So remember, after I log off, I want to be able to clean things up. So this is the area that I would clean up when that application exits. So again, I'm not bloating the profile too much. And then this is an important one. So I can do a lot of predefined settings here. So in this case, I'm using the VLC.exe, and I'm being very generic here. You can manage multiple different versions of VLC if you want to by being very specific about the path or the version number. What I can do here, though, is I've got 3 conditions set, and I'm just going to let this run a little. Depending on the OS, what language is being used. So I set a condition for an OS, and I change the language. So I have one executable, one package, but I can define different settings for different users. And in this case, I just happen to be using OS as the trigger. I could use a different condition as a trigger. This is where I tell it I want it to run as a direct flex. And I also have the ability to set environment. So with this app, we're not setting anything in the environment, but there's a couple other apps here that we are. So we're just going to flip over. This is Notepad. So with Notepad, I want to set a printer and a drive mapping. So when it launches, map the drive, map the printer. And then also with PuTTY, I also have some default settings that I put in place for it. Okay, so I'm on Windows XP here. I'm going to go ahead and launch the Notepad app. But first, let's take a look at what the drive mappings look like and what the printer mappings look like. Right now, there's just generic printer mappings, and there's really no network drive mapping right now. When I launch Notepad, remember I set up some conditions. When that launches, it's going to map that drive. It's going to map that printer for me dynamically. When I exit, which I'll do here in a second, it's going to remove that. And you can see they're gone now. So very dynamic. It'll happen on launch of the application, I do it, and I undo it on exit. And then PuTTY, remember I set up some settings here for PuTTY. There's some predefined settings. I'm on XP right now. the same user is logged into 3 different machines here. So right now I'm going to add a setting. So I, as a user, I'm going to customize a setting, and I'm going to call it from XP, because that makes it easy to identify where I did it from. Then I'm going to move over to another machine. In this case, I'm going to move over to my Windows 8 machine. I'm going to launch PuTTY again, and you'll see that my default setting plus the one I just added is there. Now I'm going to add another one called from Windows 8.1 as a different one. And then I'm going to allow that to be part of my user configuration. I can then go to a third machine, my Windows 7 machine, and see all of that still there. And I can go ahead and edit it and remove that stuff as well. So there it all is. I'm going to remove it. And I'm going to go to one more machine, back to my XP machine, I believe, and launch it again. And you'll see that my customized settings are gone because I edited them out, I removed them. So I have some control over what I do for customization. I'm going to halt the demo there because I want to leave a couple minutes here for questions. So I think there are some people with microphones. If you want to either stand up or put your hand up, if you want to ask questions, I can do that until they kick us out, and then we can do it in the hall for a few minutes.
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
UEM is currently not really supported to support active-active in a multi-data center environment.
Yep.
Is there any future?
We have all kinds of things we want to do with it. That's probably one of them. I don't know specifically when that would fall on the roadmap, but it's probably in the works. I just can't I can't talk about when that would happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
App stacks and writable volumes are a single VMDK. How can I handle backups?
Handle what?
Backups.
VCOP?
Backup.
Hiccups?
Backup.
Oh, backups, yeah. So it's still a little tricky right now. Writable volumes, we don't have a really slick way of doing that. There are some OEMs, storage platform-based backups. We've got some things coming. We're working on that. It's really a very high priority because there's not a session that we do that somebody doesn't ask that question. So like when we bring our console together later this year or early next year, we'll have the ability to automatically replicate writable volumes, so you could replicate them into another data store at a remote site or something of that nature. Right now it's still a little tricky. The app stacks, of course I can use the storage groups to move it across multiple data stores, so that helps a little bit with the app stacks, but we're definitely working on that. There's actually some BCDR papers we're working on now. We just haven't quite got things finished yet, but we're getting it going. But good question.
We're using Horizon View at the moment, and we've got like cloned Windows 7 desktop. We just install the apps manually. Mm-hmm. So obviously ThinApps are important, but we're looking at RDSH as well. Would you put ThinApps on an RDSH server? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you need the isolation, or let's say you're just a customer who spent a lot of time packaging ThinApps, you can absolutely use those on the RDSH server. You can go ahead and, when you're setting up the farm, you can actually manually add those in.
Would you recommend using RDSH with ThinApps as opposed to like a Horizon View published, like a clone desktop with ThinApps? Or
I'm going to give you the standard VMware answer. It depends.
There's lots of ways of doing things, so it's kind of like, where do you go?
Yeah. There are a lot of different ways to do it. I think you need to sit down and kind of work through the decision tree of how you want to manage things, whether you want to try to focus on RDSH-based applications or whether you want to focus on desktops. And honestly, there's still a little bit of a stylistic question there in terms of how your infrastructure works. But so there's no one answer. We give you a lot of choices, but there's no one answer that fits all.
If it's a VDI environment, is it more efficient to run like a clone desktop VM running on an ESXi host with ThinApps as opposed to an RDSH based?
Not necessarily.
Terminal services.
Yeah, not necessarily.
It's a different architecture, right? So it's totally different architecture.
Yeah.
You're doing application sharing or application hosting on terminal services versus an entirely separate container that has more resources, so it's just different from that point.
This is Rick, by the way. He works here. He's not just some random guy who jumped up and started talking.
And to your other question about the ThinApp thing, remember that some
Oh, there you go.
fantastic. Remember that some applications need to be installed in that funky mode to get RDSH to actually get them be multi.
Yeah, there's a, yeah.
So yes, you could theoretically move all of your applications, but your mileage may vary
So,
on some of that.
would you say that ThinApps are more likely to work with more, I mean, I know some applications are very fussy and won't work on RDSH. Is ThinApps the same?
They should. They
Yeah.
should just work.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about ThinApps is they're pretty portable.
Right, okay.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Is that right? Okay.
Oh, we got time for lots more.
Okay, we're still good.
That's fine. Okay.
No,
We
we're
got
still
5
good.
minutes.
We're still good.
Thanks.
You just shown how to prevent a user to change the settings in an application, but it's not preventing a user changing the settings. It's prevent settings for the next start of the applications to be changed, but the user can still change the settings and use it. It can be a security hole. I mean,
So-
if the application is got some security settings really. I mean, if
Yeah.
I really need to lock the settings of the application.
And you can. I didn't show it, but you can. I mean, you can lock them to just the predefined settings. And you can also force them back to the predefined settings. So even if during the session maybe they change something, at log off, we can toss those and just bring them back to the predefined settings. So you do have some control over that.
So it means we can completely lock the application and the user cannot change any settings inside?
Yeah, and you can do it on an application by application basis. That's one of the beautiful things about it is maybe I just have one application that I need the users to be absolutely in those settings. I can enforce that. Other questions? I think we still have time for a couple more.
No more questions?
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Appreciate your time. If you liked the session, please fill out the survey and let us know. If you didn't like the session, keep that to yourself.